So welcome. I'm Jonathan Conning. I'm in the economics department at Hunter College and here on the doctoral faculty at the Graduate Center. And so I'm very pleased to welcome you, to invite you to hear Ricardo Ffrench-Davis talk about the Chilean economy since the global crisis. Before I introduce him, let me first explain why I'm here rather than Mauricio Font, who would normally be introducing these speakers such as him. Mauricio, as it happens, is in Santiago, Chile right now, leading a delegation on the Cuban economy, a colloquium. He's organizing a colloquium between Chilean and Cuban economists in Chile, sort of a unique and new experience with economists from the University of Havana meeting Chilean economists and policymakers. So this talk is I'm supposed to tell you, is part of the Emerging Andes series. There are going to be more talks in this series on the political and economic dynamics of a changing region. I've been also asked to mention that coming up relatively soon in the Albert Bildner Legacy series are talks on Mexico, Legacies of Revolution, which will be a talk with the president of the Colegio de Mexico, Javier Garcia Diego, and that's in early May, I believe, and then another talk, China and Latin America, with speaker Adrian Hearn from the University of Sydney and Daniel Erickson from the US State Department. So those are events to look forward to. So let me introduce Ricardo Ffrench-Davis. He's a very long, impressive CV, and it's kind of hard to get started. So let me just take a little bit of time to kind of get at it in a slightly indirect way. So on September 11th, 2013, this year, will mark the 40th anniversary of the coup that brought the military regime to power in Chile and sort of changed quite radically the economic model, brought sort of the economic policies, a group of economists called the Chicago Boys sort of had free reign to kind of restructure the economy. And, but many people sort of tend to think of sort of that as sort of putting in place a model, but in fact, it was 16 years of the dictatorship, followed by my count, 21 years of a center-left Concertación coalition government, and then since 2010, a more conservative government of Sebastián Piñera. So many people say you have to be careful not to call this one model, and no one has sort of said that more clearly and insistently than Ricardo Ffrench-Davis. If you read his writings, that's something that he really emphasizes, that really have been lots of changes in the way things have been organized and both the outcomes as well as the policies in that period. Just looking at his CV, Ricardo's in some ways sort of the Forrest Gump of Chilean economic policymaking. In the best sense, Forrest Gump, if you know the movie, sort of this guy kind of shows up in all the right places and all the right meetings. And Ricardo's been a bit like that. For one, already in 1970, if I'm reading his CV correct, and you please correct me later, he had already risen to a position of deputy manager of the central bank in 1970. That's before he initiated his studies at the University of Chicago. So actually, Ricardo was in fact in that group, that cohort of students who became the Chicago Boys and studied under Arnold Harberger and others, and sort of basically knows all the players who went on to become sort of the economic team of the military dictatorship. But it became pretty clear early on that he was not going to be part of that team and distanced himself. And in fact, he sort of reappears in a very important role in helping to found CIEPLAN, the Corporación de Estudios para Latinoamérica, which is basically a think tank, not-for-profit, established. He was the co-founder in 1976 and sort of remained as the director, VP, and other things until about 1990. CIEPLAN, for those who don't know, was basically sort of the brain trust of the it was going to be, basically, it became a who's who of anyone who was going to become a minister or a policymaker or an important person in the Concertación government. So those, of course, in 76, those were dark years of the dictatorship. It was very hard to speak out. He didn't dare speak out. But as things started to sort of slowly ease, as the regime was kind of forced to in the early 80s, CIEPLAN became very, very influential in just showing the world and showing Chileans that there was a very competent group of people sort of planning for a transition, planning for a different model. And so I could go on with a long who's who of Alejandro Foxley, Jose Pablo Arellano, Patricio Meyer, Jose Gregorio, anyone who was sort of became a director of the central bank or a minister or whatever, basically ran through CIPLA. So Ricardo has been either sort of a colleague or a professor or some way related to many of these very important people. And now I get to his actual written CV. He's now still in the Department of Economics and Business of the University of Chile. He received Chile's very prestigious National Prize of Humanities and Social Sciences in 2005. I'm just going to pick out a few things because he's done many, many things. He's been the research director of the central bank in the very early years after the transition to democracy. As I said, he was CIPAN many years. He's been on many very high-level, high-level intergovernmental commissions appointed by presidents to address various issues. He started at Oxford, at Boston University, and a few other places. As an academic, he's authored or edited 21 books and over 130 articles. Probably the book that's been probably most published is a book that came out in Spanish with the title, I'll translate to English, Between Neoliberalism and Growth with Equity. And I think that's in its 4th or 5th printing in Spanish. Been translated into a few other languages, and it's now appeared in English, and this is now, I think, its 2nd printing. Economic Reforms in Chile, from Dictatorship to Democracy, and this is really sort of the authoritative, definitive study of the entire period. Right? So I highly recommend that book. Go out and buy it. So I could go on with all the other things that he has done, but I think I will probably call it quits and let him talk for himself. We have a bit less than an hour and a half, an hour and 20 minutes. Ricardo will talk for about 45, maybe a bit more, and that leave plenty of time for questions, right? So please prepare those, and thanks very much for coming.
Muchas gracias. Well, I appreciate the very generous presentation. Thank you. Well, last year we talked of, we made the long view of the Chilean economy of the last 40 years. Now we will focus more on what has been happening after as the title says, what has been happening after the arrival of the global crisis. But I will try to do very brief summary of the 40 years. Chile has had a good average performance, 5% since the 1970s, and 5 and something since 1990. We were in 1973, the Chilean average income in purchasing power parity was 23% of the US one, 23. Now we are 36%. We improved from 23 to 36, but was not a linear improvement. In the 16 years of the dictatorship, in the end, 1989, we were only 20% of the US per capita income. We went down from 23 to 20. It's not too much, but instead of going up, we went down. When we go up a lot in the 90s, what happens in the 90s? There are some significant changes with respect to the policies of the Pinochet government. In some matters that make, I think, the difference. When we move from, what you see in the column in 1973 to 89, the average growth of the Pinochet period was 2.9% per year. Less per capita than the US, that's why we went down from 23 to 20. Main changes: tax reform to improve social expenditure on education, health, household supports, better roads, better airports, etc., that were somewhat diminished during the Pinochet period. There's a very lot of information about this in the book. A lot of information, the different sectors, what happened in the first half of Pinochet, the second half of Pinochet. In the 90s, tax reform, return of rights to labor. A lot of rights of labor were forbidden, among other things, in some cases to be alive, in some cases to be free, and in some cases to organize. For example, national federations were forbidden in the Pinochet period. And in fiscal and macroeconomic matters, sharp change. Those were those that recall what happened in the 90s in Latin America, in Asia, etc. Was a boom of financial flows. That's good if you're short of financing. If you have too much, you get a flood. No se ahoga. What you have to do to have counter-cyclical regulation. Market-based. What was done in the 90s is, if too much inflows, you increase a barrier, a relative barrier, that was in money terms a sort of tax for inflows. If inflows go down, you reduce the barrier, so that you are getting what is enough to have the economy working well, but without inflation or without the exchange rate appreciation or without a large external deficit. And that was accompanied by the management of the exchange rate. And what happens in the first years of democracy is that we have the economy working, using the capacity. Demand was consistent with capacity, was productive of potential GDP, was not an excess, not a deficit, sufficient, and with the exchange rate that was sustainable through time. What had happened before in the Pinochet period? Sometimes of a very expensive dollar and sometimes of a very cheap dollar. And that is terrible for business community, for those that produce goods and services, which is the relative price of the dollar, if sometimes it's very high and sometimes it's very, very cheap. Much more about that before. The thing is that Pinochet, 16 years, 2.9% average growth of GDP. The first 9 years of democracy, 7.1%, sustained. 7.1 versus 2.9. That makes a tremendous difference during almost a decade. What happens after? There was a big change in the IMF during the 90s, along the 90s, in our profession, and it came in fashion the big ideas. Look, you develop an economy, must leave the exchange rate free. Central bank, don't touch the exchange rate. The market notes and capital flows, let them totally free. If a lot of money comes, okay, and you have a appreciated exchange rate, and then they go out, the exchange rate depreciates, and the economy adjusts. But business community and labor suffer a lot, and generate boom and bust. And that is good for speculation, very bad for total factor productivity and for sustaining growth of GDP, and with employments of better quality and small and medium firms working okay, doesn't going into bankruptcy each 5 or 10 years, what had happened in the 70s and 80s. The thing is that the fashion of free exchange rate and free flows prevail, and since 1999 we have those two features, managed by the central bank, autonomous central bank. What happens in the early 2000s? We are for 5 years in a recession. The economy for 5 years grows 2.6%, the average. 2.9, 7.1, 2.6, 2.6. That makes a difference for firms, makes a difference for productive investment, makes a difference for innovation, makes a difference for equity, and make a difference for the situation of households. What happened after these 5 years? These 5 years, 1999 to 2003, when we received the contagion of the East Asian crisis or Latin America, and in the case of Chile, 5 years in a recessive situation with large unemployment. Late 2003, we start increasing the price of commodities. And Chile, large producer of copper. And what happened? In 2003, we were working below the production frontier, the capacity to produce. We have restricted demand because we had no dollars, and we start receiving a lot of dollars. Some to the private sector, several to the public sector that owns the larger copper mining company. And Chile exports something like 50% of exports in simple terms are copper. So it means a lot of additional value of exports, additional export inflows, revenue, and additional tax for the government. And if you are below, you're not using your capacity, and you start receiving dollars, that goes into the market through the monetary system, creates demand, and supply is able to respond to the demand. If we are in the roof, you create demand, you create inflation. But if you are below the roof, you create demand, the actual GDP goes up to the roof. And we have 5 good years, 2004, 2008, with a lot of tax coming from copper and a large quantity of dollars coming in. If you have free exchange rate and a lot of dollars coming in, what happens? The exchange rate appreciates. The market, the natural response of the market. And we start having imports that go up, 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 and up. But demand was so large that there was enough demand for domestic output, but also a lot of dollars being used to imports. And comes the global crisis. And what happens with the global crisis? The price of copper goes sharply down. Capital inflows, when you have a lot of dollars, capital inflows used to come. If you have no dollars, capital outflows prevail. If you have a lot of money of your own, the financial market usually additions funds, and that is called a procyclical behavior of financial flows. FDI is much more stable through time. Financial flows tend to be much more procyclical. You are doing well, your economy is going up, you have a lot of dollars because of your export, we have inflows. When the problem came, 2009, we have fall in the price of copper and capital inflows. Capital inflows from residents and capital inflows from foreign financial investors. FDI remains rather stable, falls a bit, but is much more stable, that is very much tested. FDI, because it cannot be taken away. You open a mine, the money is there invested. Financial money can go in 5 seconds outside. Very important how we learn to make that stable so that it contributes to capital formation and stable economic development. Well, drop in the price of copper, drop in the quantity of exports, a lot in the few non-traditional exports that Chile has, they go down. This was a strong effect across the world. The price of commodities went down, the quantity of non-commodities go down. The different adjustment is standard across history. 2,000 years ago, it happened at something of that sort. The price of commodities is much more flexible. The quantity of manufacture and other export is more sensitive. What happens in 2009 with these effects? Aggregate demand goes down. GDP is not destroyed. You are not generating GDP, but you were able to produce more than you're producing now because demand went down. Because the government has less proceeds, because the capital flows went out, so credits, loans in the domestic market are repressed, and people, household, firms have less money to spend. It's a sort of automatic adjustment. Response of the government. We have the capacity. Our economy was in a route of something like 4.5% or 5% going up, and the economy went down 1%. We have about 6 points of capacity. What is missing? Demand. What is missing in the US? Demand today. What is missing in France today? Demand. But how can you increase demand? You need some conditions. Chile had a rather ordered fiscal situation. The treasury was a creditor of the world, not a debtor. They had spent part of the money of the copper, but had saved some other part of the money. Had reserves of about $25 billion or something of that sort. That is a lot for Chile. So say, I have the money. I don't need to ask to the IMF for anything. This is my money. It's invested in around the world in sovereign funds. I can use this. What happened with tax proceeds? In 2008, mostly in the last 2 or 3 months after September, the big shock was September to 2008. Tax proceeds went down 10%. In 2009, they went down 20%. You lose 30% because it's very sensitive to the price of copper. You have lost 30% of tax proceeds. The standard recipe, if you lose receipts, you reduce expenditure. No, I have insufficient demand, I have to do the opposite. And the government of President Bachelet, I think yesterday flew back to Chile, yesterday was here visiting, we have to increase expenditure in this situation. That is the proper counter-cyclical policy in that situation, not in 2013, in 2009. And there's a big increase in expenditure of 17%. Income goes down, expenditure goes up, and in what sort of things? Subsidies to the hiring of young unemployed workers, anticipating a social security reform that would have taken place to 10 or 11, to do it now. That means putting money in the market in an economy that will have a lack of sufficient domestic demand. To push investment in housing that provides there was building firms were suffering a drop in demand. They have capacity. let us use capacity. One thing that the macro must make in the economy is use what you have. Use what you have. The people that is able was working 1 year ago, they're capable to work. They are not incapable. They're capable, they need the demand, so to become employed. Up to the point of reaching their roof. Not too little, not too much. And that is the art of doing good macroeconomics. Don't create inflationary situation that has happened in the past in many Latin American countries, including Chile in 30 or 40 years ago. And what we have is very short. It's interesting how short was it. By September, October of 2009, the economy had stopped going down and now was growing about 4% per year in a 12-month period. In November, December, January, we had been able to stop the drop. That was about a 3% drop. That is similar to the figure, a little bit smaller than the figure of the US in 2009. And the European, there was 3 and something, some countries 5 or 6, some other 1%, Germany. But we are able to sustain recovery. And we still had free exchange rate. What happens? Big devaluation. We needed devaluation because we were in an uncertain world. But what is bad? Big appreciation, big devaluation. What is the true exchange rate for my investment that I want to produce exports intensive in value added? I compete with imports. What is the exchange rate that I consider in deciding I am going to invest in this activity that competes with imports, or imports at $400, 400 pesos per dollar? I cannot survive. 600, fantastic. Chile has had 760, 435 pesos per dollar. With that big range. It's unusual. It's the natural response in an economy, open economy, in a developing economy, with a very large export industry, with a sensitive price that is very fluctuating, the price. And since it's so small, some few billions of dollars of inflows make a big difference in the short run. And if they go out, also a big difference in the other direction. Very bad for business, very bad for employment, decent employment, very bad for innovation, very bad for those that think how to progress through time, improving the quality of how you generate goods and services in your firms or in your personal work. Very bad. Very bad if one wants a good market with development. Development, bigger GDP, better distributed GDP. Something happens, unfortunately. February 27, 2010, a big earthquake. And that affects, in February, the recovery that was going on affects in a significant part. But this has been counted by the new government, the present government, by the central bank, and we estimate that destroyed a lot, but about 2% of productive capacity. And when we were growing, recovering at 4% speed, we were still a lot below, quite below, because before we were growing 4.5% or 5%, we went down 1%. We had 6% place, room to recover, and we destroyed 2%. That doesn't affect the roof, but we're below the roof. If you're in the roof producing, everybody occupied, and comes the earthquake, GDP has to go down. There's no alternative. If you're below the roof, a lot below the roof, and it's destroyed, you don't need to go to reduce the actual GDP. And what happens? After 1 month that the things are reorganized, put back the people to work, etc., the economy takes up the productive effort again. And we have a roof very much up. And that was the start of the new government, March 2010. 13 days after the earthquake took over the Concertación Democrática left the government, lost the government, and came the conservative government of President Piñera, a former student in 1972. What has happened since then? Recall 2009. We were in recession. We have the roof. We were producing below. The government makes a counter-cyclical policy. We need the additional demand. There's a sharp drop in the interest rates, sharp increases in expenditure of the government, and the demand is going up. The earthquake made its effect, but it was not permanent. It was, we are moving up. Then 1 month after, we have all the data from the central bank showing, look, the demand picks up again. And supply can respond because we have labor and capital underutilized. We can keep on going up with GDP. And what we have had in 2010, 2011, and 2012, significant increases in demand and significant and the supply, GDP, going behind, also increasing. That's good. We are using labor and capital. It's good. Target of macro policy. But also a target of macro policy is and have sustainable changes in the economy. And there are two things, or three things, that are significant and are not sustainable today at this situation. In 2010 were, in 2011, half, to 12, much less. Today, my view is that even more or less so. And they should be correct. Fiscal policy. Here we have, that is the trend GDP. This is the actual GDP. This is the figures that I mentioned. We estimate an independent committee of the Ministry of Finance said the economy could grow. If you look the line 3 and 4. You will see what happened with the price of copper. That is in the nominal terms, but the inflation is quite low in this time. This great moderation times, what was thought a great moderation, slow inflation in Chile, in Peru, and Brazil, and US, and Germany, everywhere in the West world, and East Asia also. The price of copper. There are two prices. One that is what is estimated, the trend copper price, that is other committee of the consulting committee with the Treasury in Chile, that estimates how is moving the roof, the potential GDP, and how is moving the trend copper price. And you see in 2004, 2007, the committee was saying, look, the trend price is 100 cents. We estimate that in the next years, the price will be $1 per pound. In 2012, more or less the same people in that committee says, look, the future of the market is 302. Multiply by 3 times in this very short period the estimate of what happens, what would happen in the market. Now the fact is that the actual price has been even higher. As you see there, 204 to 207 it was 2.31, and the average 10 to 12 is 368. And in general terms, the government spends the trend price, it's called a structural fiscal balance, and the excess goes to the sovereign fund in general. This year 2012, a part of that money was spent by the government. I will go to that. So we have the view, look, some people that said 5 or 6 years ago, price 100. That same people say more or less for the same time. This is a long-term estimation, is 300 cents. Question, how much has changed the copper market in the world? There are changes, 2, 3 changes. Some things are similar 7 years ago. The presence of China and the intensity, part of the intensity of expenditure. China was growing very fast at those times. But some other things have happened in the way copper is produced. How it's being produced in Peru, Chile, Indonesia, etc. And the other things, if you look in if you look in line 6, fiscal expenditure growth, you see the big jump in 2009, counter-cyclical policy. We have shortage of demand, we need to increase demand. The private sector is not spending, they are waiting for us. We go into the market. We have a large fiscal increase. The market responds, and then the private sector comes from behind and incorporates into the market. And we have by 2010 that private expenditure is large. How we know? We go to look into domestic demand, we go to look into imports and see, they're increasing fast. What one expects in that situation? That fiscal policy to make counter policy. If domestic demand is low, we push up. If domestic demand is high, we push down. If in this situation we spend a lot, those have to be transitory expenditure. Subsidies provided, bonds, special bonds to household, for example. Transitory reduction in taxes on the banking sector, transitory reduction in the way you pay the income tax, etc. Transitory. When the economy recovers, you have to return to normality in those things. Does this happen? It did not happen. What we see in that line, if you look to 10 to 12, touch this goes out, 5% increase, one could say, 5% is small. Yes, no. It comes after a big increase. You are increasing, moderate something that already was high. You don't have to look only to the margin, but you have to look to the level. And the level of expenditure has gone a lot up in a situation where in March 2013 we are full employment of labor, a scarcity of labor, full sellings in the retail activities, and huge, very huge imports. And how you finance that? With a high price of copper. In 2012, the government spent the equivalent to 330 cents per pound of copper. In 2004, 2007, we were spending less than 100 cents. The government had a surplus. The trend was estimated to be 100 and was spending less than that, some 90 cents or something of that sort. Now, 330. If the price of copper stays up, it's okay. What is happening in those that live in the copper industry? The people investing $1 billion, $3 billion, putting for the next 20 years. What price they use for their investment project? So the evaluación de proyecto. They're using 270, 280, 280 cents. The government is living too much on these 330 cents, because if the price goes down, not only the government loses tax proceeds, but usually the market goes into panic. And we have a big outflow of money. We had that in 82, we had a little bit in 95, a very large in 99, in 2001 and 2002, we had in 2009. Is this over? No. The history, of course, repeats. It's the natural behavior of markets that would happen. You should not create fiscal dependence on a price that is risky, too high. What else is happening? That is the history of the copper price. Huh? What is happening? External sector. I mentioned that in the recessive period of 99 to 2003, we have a very high price of the dollar, very depreciated exchange rate, a lot of pesos per dollar. Then came the period of copper or commodity proceeds, a lot of dollars, dollar shift. And you observe what has been happening, only with the exception of 2009. The red column, imports, cleaned from prices. This is what is called quantum of volume of exports and imports. All the time, imports growing much faster than exports. And you see that in the end, since 2008, we have a very tiny increase of exports. Explanation: market response, unstable exchange rate, unstable in an appreciated level, few pesos per dollar. Message to exports: don't put value added in your exports. I'm punishing that. Appreciated exchange rate means that Chilean labor is expensive in dollar terms. We depreciate, the same quantity of pesos means less dollars because of labor, the cost of domestic inputs, etc. We have a bad performance on non-traditional export. We are increasing the dependence not only on the price of copper, but on the volume of copper. We had good in the 80s, not in the 70s. 77 to 81 it was bad. In the 80s and 90s, we were increasing the room for non-traditional exports. Diversifying export, that was good, more connected to the domestic economy. And the imports going up a lot. What happens with imports? Capital goods, that's good, create capacity. Intermediate goods, they're substituting domestic intermediate goods. And a lot of consumer goods. What happened with consumer goods? They have value added, arrives to the frontier, and they have to go into the consumer. Transportation, services, etc. That's good. It's value added, but it's value added that is part of GDP. We have a growing component of GDP that is services in the trading of inputs. Imports partly financed with a too high price of copper. So we have other component of our activity that is dependent on something that is a risky bet. What happened at that? 77 to 81, to a much larger degree, 5 times now. It was 21% deficit in external account. Now we are in about 8% or 7% in what counts well everything. But risky and bad for the sustainability of the economy. And these are additional emphasis on the role of the exchange rate. It's curious that the approach more standard in economic policy of the free exchange rate. Let the market identify the exchange rate day to day, and let inflows and outflows totally free without any regulation. China regulates that, US regulates until 89, Belgium until 93, and Chile this comes out in a framework where it is said, look, you have to have development strategy based in export promotion. And you leave at the same time the exchange rate totally free. The experience in Brazil, in Argentina, in Peru, in Costa Rica, in Mexico, in Korea has been that in those times where the exchange rate fluctuates a lot, it weakens the quality of export. And consequently, the quality of export is contributing less to the sustained growth of GDP through time. So this intrinsic contradiction. And what is that, contradiction based? Here I was simply saying that today the exchange rate is much more relevant than 30 years ago. 30 years ago, all countries, US, Europe, Japan, Chile, were using, 40 years ago, were using a lot of tariff, 100%, 200%, etc., 40%. Korea had 70% average for 5,000 products in the 70s or early 80s. And non-tariff restriction, etc., etc., etc. All those things were playing the role of the exchange rate. Now the exchange rate is alone. In the case of Chile, we don't have those things playing around. So what affects the decision of producers and consumers, what I produce, how do I produce, what I consume, between tradables and non-tradables, is strongly affected by the real exchange rate. And if you believe it's going to be stable or not stable for time. And what happened in Chile? Things that I believe are, if one considers the dynamics of the economy. The green or azul, the blue, celeste. The blue line is actual price of the dollar considering all the partners of Chile. It's a basket of inflation of all our partners and the exchange rate of all our partners, expressed in dollars equivalent, and defined in the Latin American way. Moving up implies depreciation, down appreciation, the opposite of the US or British. You see that these are not a one-shot adjustment. I think this is very important for the allocation of resources and for development. It's not one-shot changes. And we have two sorts of changes. One that when we are depreciating, we have short-run noises, up and down. What that do in the market? Very little. Users of dollars, or producers of dollars, simply use derivatives. 5 days, 20 days, 30 days derivative. They eliminate that instability. But you don't have derivatives good and cheap and well available in the market for 2, 3, 4, 5 years. And what you learn is that the future price is very similar to the spot price. The future price is not the price that is going to be in the future. If you collect information, the future price of today is usually very different of the actual future price in the future. And it's natural that you cannot compare two things, survive at the same time and a future price that is totally different to the spot price. It doesn't, because of the nature of the market, how the agents operate. Because what works is the stability. Look, I want dollars in 30 days, I get assured today of that, and I don't care what actually comes in 30 days. I got what I need for my business, which that is enough. And that is very active in the world and in Chile. $13 billion of short-run operation of derivatives. That is published by the central bank. So we have this noise and the fact that we were for several years moving up, for several years going down, for several years going up, for several years going down. And when that is happening, the producers and the consumers are observing that the thing is going, for example, down, 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 down. It prevails in the market the view, look, this will continue. It will continue appreciating, appreciating. And I make allocative decisions based on that. I get away from adding value to exports. I get away to competing with Chinese imports. Chinese imports that before they paid 11% average tariff, and now they're paying 0. So we have an exchange rate without tariff. Before we have the exchange rate with tariff. That affects, obviously, the market. You get away of producing these trade-offs. And usually in the periods where the exchange rate is appreciating, those are the years when there's optimism. We are in 2004 to 2008, or 1990 to 97, 98. Capital inflows trying to go into the market. In this case, being able to go in other cases, restricted to market counter-cyclical policies. And periods in which the credit market is fluid, but you have exchange rate appreciation. And the market takes this and the newspaper, the financial newspaper, every day, look, our future is very cheap dollars, very few pesos per dollar. You don't, you have the optimism of the economy, you have loans available, but the exchange rate is telling you, don't be silly, don't use the credit, don't your optimism, use it consuming cheap imported goods, not producing imported goods. What happens in the other version? When capital flows go away, the price of copper goes down, recession. What happens with the mood? Bad mood. They're pessimistic, generalizing. This is very contagious. You see what happens in the surveys, the monthly surveys, no more consumption, less investment, etc. And the dollar very much depreciated, expensive dollar, incentive to invest, but the financial market is closed. That happened in all the situations I have mentioned. The financial market is procyclical. If everybody is in bad mood, they don't start opening the pockets, they close them. They renew some credits, and we know by aggregate data, and we know that the small and medium firms are much more affected by that. So we have a asymmetry of effects that are very bad for development, for equity, and for good production of export. And approaching to the end, it's very common that some colleagues say, look, but if you want to regulate exchange rates, means going against the market. And what I offer is, no, the market is not one aggregated element. We have segments of the market. We have the people that lives in the short run, that is very necessary to have liquidity. They have an essential role in development, but in the short run investment. Short run investment is not long-term investment. We need long-term for capital formation, equipment, machinery, housing, infrastructure, etc. That is the essence of the sustain of GDP. In the US, in China, or in Chile. You need all these bricks and steels and so on, in simple terms. So what we want is to make the market related to development and exchange rate, and that is the people that produce exportables and produce importables, produce trade. And that the market needs more stability through time, so we need what is called a managed flexibility of the exchange rate, managed by the central bank or the Ministry of Finance, depending on the country. In Chile would be the central bank, is in charge of this, so that a sustainable movement through time of the exchange rate prevails in the market. And to avoid the disparadas arriba, when the outliers exchange rate that go too much up or too much down, as it happened since 2009, since 1999, the last 14 years. And summary, good performance through time, these ups and downs stop. We are still 36% of the US per capita GDP, with much greater inequality. Inequality associated to what is called structural heterogeneity. We have a lot of difference in quality of in labor and in firms. It is interesting that if we take the average, it's 36%, and we go into our markets, and we find that the champions of the Chilean economy are very similar in productivity to the champions of the US. And if our champions are similar, and we're only 36% in average, where's the difference? The difference is in informal sectors, small and medium firms. There are the big spreads of productivity between a US firm or a German firm or workers and the Chilean one. And that makes a very significant recommendation. Look, your policy has to bet not to the champions. You must provide harmony and social peace for the champions, but you have to bet for increasing the productivity of the informals, reducing informality. We have a large informality, much less than Peru or Colombia or Brazil, but too much for a country of $17,000 per capita. We have to reduce that, and small and medium firms that have severe problems of quality, partly because of the things missing in the market. And what are the things missing? In the last 3 lines, we have a financial market that is very limited for small and medium firms. They still have difficulties in having access to long-term financing at rather normal interest rates that are not 40% a year. That is not sustainable, highly sustainable for the common small and medium firm. 40% a year with the inflation rate of 12 of 1.5% a year. 38% in real terms. That is crazy. It's a failure of the financial market. It has to be solved if you want to reduce significantly inequality and to reduce the gap, the development gap with the more advanced economies of the world. And we take in macroeconomic approaches counter-cyclical policy. We should return to regulating the exchange rate so that it is friendly with the market. The exchange rate of 760 or 435 is extremely unfriendly with the market of the producers of trading. Unfriendly. Interest rate of 40%, unfriendly with the market. We must be friendly with those that create wealth, those that create the GDP. We need to correct macroeconomic approach, moving to what I call the macro for development. And being able to regulate the aggregate demand close to productive capacity, and to move ahead in what is called modern productive development policies. That is an interesting proposal of a committee covering all the political spectrum and economic approaches. 207, proposing to develop clusters around successful exports, where we are producing export with low linkages to the domestic economy. Copper buys a lot of imports from abroad to move gradually in the direction of encouraging the production of intermediate goods, some capital goods, some services, gradually putting the money that puts the government in encouraging innovation, the equivalent of our National Science Foundation, and correcting the exchange rate, and correcting the capital market, and trying to articulate the effort of the public and the private sector in this sector. The production of copper, of forestry, of salmons, of tourism, 5 or 6 sectors in a way to start combining the market. They were chosen by the market. The market says you are champions in salmons, copper, forestry, but help to integrate more those activities to the domestic economy. Who has done that? Maybe Australia, New Zealand, Scandinavians, Chinese, Malaysian, 10 or 15, Korean, etc., to combine the market and public policy. And finally, discussion, tax revenue. We have a very low tax rate, 18% of GDP. Plus COP is something like 22%. And all those things, if we want to improve education, to make a significant labor training and small entrepreneurs training, we need more resources, well spent, gradually, and we need a significant rebalance of voices in society. The part of the public opinion is exploiting in demands, many times contradictory demands, and when you are not able to channel that, you end societies that are conflictive and that don't move forward. And I think we have a very good opportunity to reintegrate these voices that have exploited against abuses, against fraud, against lack of consideration, and that the countries reap to make a step forward and to be able to sustain a significant growth of GDP with much more equity in the future. And open with any questions.